Welcome to Real Therapy Gone Wrong, where a film reel meets real life. We are Brandie Sellers,
And Lindsay Murray.
two sex therapists who point out the difference between Hollywood therapy and real life therapy. This show does not constitute a therapeutic relationship. In today's episode, we're covering the show Scrubs, Season 5, Episode 13, titled My Five Stages, which can be viewed on Hulu. Lindsay is going to recap the show, and then we'll chime in as we go to comment on therapy and other mental health issues. Take it away, Lindsay.
Awesome. I am very excited to cover Scrubs. Have you seen a lot of Scrubs before or
Yes, I am a dinosaur, and I watched Scrubs when it actually was out the first time on TV when you had to wait, between episodes a whole week, but I haven't rewatched it since it's been streaming, so it was fun to go back into the show and watch it again.
Yeah, absolutely. I've seen Scrubs through at least a few times, and so it's yeah, one of my beloved shows that I like to watch. And for anyone who hasn't seen Scrubs, I'll just give you kind of a quick summary of what the show's about. But Scrubs is a medical comedy drama television series that follows the lives of medical interns, residents, and attending physicians at Sacred Heart Hospital, which is a teaching hospital. So the main characters start as freshly out of school, they're residents, and they work their way up to, attending physicians. And so, interesting fact, the creators of the show would interview real doctors and nurses to get an accurate depiction of what actually happens at a hospital. Like what are the trials and tribulations that come with working at a hospital? And some people say that Scrubs is the most accurate medical show out there. Take that with a grain of salt. I don't know how I would prove that, but it's just as I was looking at trivia about the show, that came up quite a bit. So in this episode, it starts out with Dr. Elliot Reed, who's played by Sarah Chalk, and her and this guy she's dating, Keith, who also works at the hospital. Keith is played by Travis Schultz. They're on the couch making out, kind of doing a role play, she's in costume, and then JD, or John Dorian, they call him JD, who's played by Zach Braff. He's there, also in costume, and he's watching. And I guess he's part of the foreplay. So really the start of the episode is just showing this weird dynamic between the three of them. And if for anyone who has watched the show, there's always this on again, off again kind of relationship between Elliot and JD. And so, but now she's with this guy, Keith. Um, Zach Braff, or sorry, just Zach Braff, who plays JD. JD is always the narrator of the show. So throughout the episode, is him narrating. Fun fact about Zach Braff, who plays JD, before the show, he would go on rounds with real doctors to prepare for the show, and he would even visit patients with them. And JD is also based on the creator's friend, the creator, Bill Lawrence. He had a friend called John Doris that he went to college with, who is in the medical field. JD's based on real life John Doris.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's cool.
Yeah. And then Elliot is based on John Doris's wife, Dolly. So it's very, very weird, very random fun fact. So it goes to the hospital, and we see Mrs. Wilk, who's played by Michael Learned. She is a favorite patient at the hospital. And I'm going to give a little bit of backstory on the character, Mrs. Wilk, on kind of how she ends up where she is, because I think to know how she got reinfected, now she's really sick, you kind of have to know what happened in the prior episode. But she initially got sick. She had a lung infection that took her to the hospital. She got the medication she needed. She got the treatment she needed. She recovered. But then, unfortunately, this man his nickname was Cabbage, but he was a medical intern. He wasn't cutting it. They were letting him go. As Miss Wilkes is recovered, she's in the hospital. Cabbage picks up a dirty medical glove and then goes and shakes her hand. So she gets reinfected from that interaction. And unfortunately, this infection is fatal, because you hear them talking about, she's not, I think as JD's narrating, he says she's not going to make it this time. And it shows them, when I say them, I mean JD, and then also Dr. Cox, or Dr. Perry Cox, who's a big character in the show. He's played by John C. McGinley. Dr.
Hilarious.
Yeah, totally. And so Dr. Cox and JD, they both love Mrs. Wilk. she is a favorite patient of theirs. It shows them on the roof with her, and they like very endearing, very sweet. They set up this whole beach scene on the roof of the
So
hospital.
sweet.
So sweet. There's like sand, there's the chairs, there's the umbrella, and they even have like a mocktail up there. And they know that she's like really, really sick. A little bit more info on like Dr. Cox and JD. A theme throughout the show is that JD wants Dr. Cox's approval so badly through the
So
whole
bad.
show, so badly. And Dr. Cox, he can be a real cock. I mean, seriously, he can be such an asshole, but he is, to me, a very beloved character because deep down he really cares. So, anyway, they're sitting on the roof, and Miss Wilk is saying that she's never been afraid of death, and death has always been a motivator to live. And she starts
Mhm.
telling stories of it kind of gave her this bravery, this courage to go for what she wanted in life. And then she says now that she's facing death, she's so scared and like doesn't know why. And it's a really emotional moment because you can tell Dr. Cox and JD, they're tearing up, and there's like not a lot to say to that. So it goes back, it goes back to they're back in the hospital. She's back in her bed, and she had called the hospital grief counselor. And his name is Lester Hedrick, who's played by Dave Foley. She calls the grief counselor. You can immediately tell, especially Dr. Cox does not like this grief counselor, is kind of like, we don't need help with grief. Like, we've got this. But the patient wants him there. The counselor, Lester Hedrick, he comes in and he's making jokes at first. He even says, which one of you is going to kick it? And he like looks at Dr. Kai. He's like, I don't think it's going to be you. And then he looks at JD and says, you have the look of someone who's going to die young. And so he's like making these little jabs. Miss Wilk thinks he's funny. And JD narrating is like, I don't like him. And he explains that the stages of grief are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and then acceptance. And he says to the doctors, he's like, "Oh, I assume that y'all are going to tell her, or y'all are going to walk her through the process of what death looks like," which they were not in the middle of doing. But Dr. Cox is like, "Well, we were doing that until you walked in." And so he's like, "All right, well, continue." And the grief counselor just stands there. He's like, "Okay, well, continue." And he's like, waiting, waiting. Dr. Cox is like, "JD, like, you explain it." And of course, he does a terrible job of explaining it because he's on the spot. And he's like, he says, I wrote this verbatim. He goes, death is like a journey in a boat. A giant light shines down on your boat and carries you up to the heavens. And the grief counselor says, that was the ending to Cocoon.
Which at the time the show first aired, everyone would have seen because it was like
Hmm.
the Oscar-winning movie of the day. Yeah.
Yeah, so it was like kind of just a hilarious moment, but you can tell, especially from Dr. Cox, and JD is just kind of mirroring what he does because he wants his approval so bad. Dr. Cox is just very uncomfortable with the grief counselor. And so I wanted to, before I like continue on the rest of the episode, I wanted to just talk about the 5 stages of grief really quickly. The denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Throughout this episode, they show those stages like in order, but you and I both know grief is not necessarily linear, and you can repeat some of the stages. You can be in denial, you can be in bargaining, and then you might take a step forward, and then you can take a step back at any point in time because grief is really complicated.
Yeah, and it never ends necessarily. Like,
Yeah.
you could be sad about someone you lost 20 years ago.
Yeah.
I
Have you
like there Go ahead.
Oh, you go, sorry.
I was gonna say there's sort of like a dual model that I like, which is like one side is more like moving forward, attending to life, and one side is more like when you're feeling more grief and more loss, and you're maybe crying or grief is intruding on your life, and so, and it can look like that for a long time, right? That we can be moving on. And sometimes when we have a loss, we might just be in the like doing all the things mode and we might not be crying or upset. Like that might be delayed. And there isn't one right way or wrong way to do that. I think that's the biggest thing that we all need to know is there isn't one right way.
No, and it can look so differently for everybody. I hear that quite a bit. like even for myself, but even from clients, if there is this really big loss and they haven't cried about it, it's easy to feel like, well, what's wrong with me? Why haven't I cried? And the answer is there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, sometimes that's just the state of mind you're in. It can be shock, it can be you're surviving, maybe you're
Yeah.
compartmentalizing because you have to keep working. Like there's all kinds of ways to cope. And I don't necessarily think one way is right or the other. Have you ever heard of the ball of grief before?
Is that the one with the button in the room?
Yeah.
Yeah, I have, but tell everybody about it.
Yeah, I share that one a lot with clients, but it's essentially like, you imagine there's a box and there's a button in the box. It just sticks out a little bit, but it's like that trigger button. And when grief is really fresh, there's this ball inside the box and the ball is so big initially because the grief is so fresh. So it's essentially always hitting that button. And that button can look whatever that does to you is what it does. Over time, the ball gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and then it gets small enough to where it bounces around in the box, and so it might not hit that button for a really long time. It could be a year, 5 years, 10 years, whatever, and then something can happen, and that ball hits the button, and then
Mhm.
all of the grief can feel like it comes flooding back in, and that's why when, kinda like you said, grieving never really ends. You might feel fine for a long time, but you hear a song that reminds you of that person or a picture pops up in your memories and then it can all kind of come back. So,
Yeah, and we don't want it to end, like, we don't wanna
no.
forget about that person that we loved and lost. Also, have experienced grief as a sensory experience before
Mhm.
where, like, my mom used to make cinnamon toast a lot. And one time I was in my kitchen a few years after she died and I was sprinkling cinnamon and like the cinnamon hit my nose in just some type of way. And immediately I started bawling and like there I was in my grief because
Yeah.
of this cinnamon, right? So we also don't know what is going to happen that is going to make the ball hit that button that's going to be just the right thing that is going to bring those bittersweet memories. But they are bittersweet. There's a loveliness to them.
Yeah, totally. I think it's very lovely. And you're right, you don't want it to end because you always want to remember them somehow, even if it makes you upset in the moment. A really beautiful way of looking at it is it's another way that you're remembering them. And
Yeah.
that is okay. Something we've talked about, you and I, just like personally, as far as like how grief can look, and this is a little bit off topic, but like in like the true crime realm, like you like if someone's spouse gets killed and you automatically look at the spouse because you're like they didn't cry, they didn't say anything. I always hate when like that becomes the focus because we don't really know if that means anything or not. That could just be them in total
Yes.
shock. Now,
Yes.
sometimes maybe they are guilty and they did kill their spouse, but, that doesn't necessarily mean for sure. But you see that so much in true crime, they automatically look at, well, how are they grieving? How are they showing up? I don't know if we could put a lot of stock into that.
Yeah, I don't think we can at all. That always annoys me. I'm, like, yelling at the speakers when when I hear that because we don't know. Like, some people freeze and shut down, and that could look like someone is very calm in a difficult experience, and that doesn't necessarily mean that they're the ones who did the crime or like, there
Yeah.
isn't a typical way to look when you have a loss either, you know? Like,
Yeah.
some people are very sedate, some people cry. Like, one of my great aunts literally wailed down the aisle at my grandfather's funeral. Like, there's just not one right or wrong way, and we have to
No.
not make meaning out of the ways that other people are grieving and make judgments about that.
I totally agree. So it's in a way like going back to this episode, I thought it was nice that Miss Wilk called the grief counselor. Even as she's facing death, she just wanted that support, which I think is really lovely.
She's like the
Um,
sanest person in the episode.
she is. The Dr. Cox and JD are like losing their minds and yeah, she's handling it better than everybody else and she's the patient in this scenario. Going back to Dr. Cox being uncomfortable with the grief counselor, he says to him directly, he says, "We don't need any of your head shrinking. Oh, because the grief counselor offers them support. I think he even
Mhm.
says, like, sometimes people who are really close to the person who's passing away can also go through the stages of grief. And if y'all ever want to talk, like, I'm here. And he just really snaps at him, is like, we don't need any of your head shrinking. We can handle death just fine. And then he starts saying, like, I have no buttons. I'm buttonless. And he's just like macho, like, I don't need anything. And the grief counselor does such a good job of just letting that roll off his back. He is not threatened at all by Dr. Cox. He's like, whatever. And I think Dr. Cox says, like, the counselor is impervious to my threats, and this annoys me. He wants to be threatening. And the counselor's like, hey, whatever you need. Like, I'm here, moving on. And then, it shows this is not necessarily about grief, but it's just like a funny part of the episode that just shows you how hard JD is trying. I think he pretends that his like scooter is broken. And so Dr. Cox is like, fine, you can ride home with me. And so he gets into his car, which is a Porsche, and he's like trying to make this good impression. And he opens this root beer, which Dr. Cox is like, don't open it. It's going to explode. It's been rolling around. He's like, have you ever heard of the John Dorian 3-tap method? It works every time. And then, of course, the root beer explodes all over his car. And then, like, moving forward, he loses front seat privilege in Dr. Cox's car. So that part was really funny. It goes back to the hospital, and Miss Wilk is getting cold. She's getting weaker, and she's looking weaker. Like, you can tell that it's not okay. And Dr. Cox starts saying, well, maybe she could still turn this around. And the grief counselor pops up. That's kind of a theme of the episode. The grief counselor just pops up out of nowhere. He's like, maybe she could turn this around. And the grief counselor pops up and goes, hey, denial. Like, this is the first stage of grief. And he makes a joke, and he says, the grief counselor says, yeah, she could totally turn around. Look, she could be in a vitamin commercial, like being sarcastic. She looks so unwell. And Dr. Cox says, how would you like to be in a broken jaw commercial? And again, he ignores the threat. He just says, well, people close to the patient can also go through the 5 stages of grief, and clearly, like, you're in denial. So then him and JD are like angry at the grief counselor. But again, JD's not really angry. He's just going along to be on Dr. Cox's good side. And so they march up to this support group that the grief counselor is running, and to give him a piece of Dr. Cox can give him a piece of his mind, because he's really upset about being accused of like being in denial. So he storms into this support group for the terminally ill. And he's like basically saying this guy's a hack. And one of the participants says, well, he's actually helped me a lot. And everyone kind of has the counselor's back. Like, no, he's been really helpful. And then he asks the whole group, he's like, what stage of grief is Dr. Cox going through right now? And they all at the same time, they're like, anger, which is just kind of hilarious, because I think it made him even more angry because he storms out. And it goes back to the hospital, and you hear Dr. Cox again saying, I would do anything if she could pull through this. And it's like, hey, bargaining. Now you're at the bargaining stage. And then it could be any minute now. Like, they're watching her, she's dying, and she does die in that moment. They're both clearly upset. Dr. Cox has tears in his eyes. They're both just quiet. And now they're in the depression stage. But what was really lovely is the grief counselor doesn't say it. Like, the joke is kind of over. He doesn't
Mhm.
say, now you're in depression. He just says, she was really lucky to have you both as doctors. And letting go is never easy. And so it was really like sad, but really nice. And then the joke eventually comes back, because at some point they're like, they're standing on the roof, like reflecting on how great she was. And the counselor's like, acceptance, you've reached acceptance. So they go through those stages like very quickly, because it's a very short episode.
Mhm.
But it was a really lovely portrayal of
I
like
thought so too.
what those stages can look like.
And I thought Dave Foley did a great job of walking the line between humor and also like and the counselor that part was written really well, I feel like, especially at the
Yeah.
time the show aired. like we all did really believe in those 5 stages of grief and that you would get to acceptance and that would be that, right? And so I think he did a great job with that episode.
He did, and I really loved the dynamic between him and Dr. Cox, because Dr. Cox really wants to be this, like, threatening, intimidating guy, and him as a counselor is just kind of like, "I know you're just upset because your favorite patient is dying, so, like, I'm not really gonna take this seriously,"
Yeah,
because I know, like, he knows you're just going through it because 'cause you're losing someone that you really care about, which I thought was really lovely, and kind of like that does fit into our role as counselors. If a client ever got, like, really, really upset with me, it's nice to remember, like, you're just in pain.
yeah. And also that one thing I experienced as a cancer patient is I could tell that my doctors liked me, and I could also see how other people, not that anybody got treated bad, but I could tell I was some doctor's favorite patient, and that was actually really nice. And I
Yeah.
think also as counselors, I have unconditional positive regard for all of my clients.
Yeah.
But there are some of those clients that touch my heart more for whatever reason
Yeah.
than other clients, and I think that, like, even in this show portraying that, like, doctors have feelings, counselors have feelings, and we develop attachments to people also.
Yeah, I think it would be impossible not to.
Yeah,
Like, kinda like you said, it's not like we have favorites and we treat them better. It's just you just have those clients that really hit your heart even more, and I think we'd be lying to ourselves if we didn't admit that. You know what I mean? That can
for
happen.
sure,
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
sure.
So I thought, as far as, I mean, one great episode because it is Scrubs, but I thought that the counseling was portrayed really well too. And he seemed like a really good counselor. I mean, the support group really thought that he was helpful, and he was there for Mrs. Wilk when she
Yeah,
called. So,
I thought so too, and kudos to them for making a show about death that was, like, sort of equal part serious and funny. I think just the way they wrote the show was excellent to handle a difficult topic.
yeah, I thought so too. And I feel like that's kind of the whole show, like the whole series. They do a really good job of that, walking that line between, like, the humor is not inappropriate. You know what I mean? It's a funny
Yeah.
show, but they also, like, handle it really delicately with, like, what patients might be going through. And there's an episode, I think it's, like, later in the series, but, Dr. Cox says something like, "We wouldn't survive here if we didn't joke, if we didn't laugh." Like, I know, like, from the outside, it could look like maybe we're being harsh, but we're surrounded by illness and death every day, and you've got to get through it somehow. And so I think they did a good job of showing, like, what that could look like, of just
Mhm.
getting through that line of work.
I think so too.
Yeah. Well, anything else
Awesome.
to add for this episode?
I don't think so.
Okay. If you enjoyed this episode of Real Therapy Gone Wrong, please like, review, subscribe, and follow us where you listen to your podcasts. In our next episode, we will discuss the show Ted Lasso, Season 2, Episode 1, titled Dogs, Yips, and Bad Dates, which you can stream on Apple TV. If you'd like Real Therapy Gone Right, we are two actual therapists who help clients on a daily basis. Contact us if you'd like to learn more about our work or want to hire us. You can find me, Lyndsey, at relationshipmatterstx.com, or Brandie at sellerscounseling.com. If you're making a movie or TV show and do not want to find your show on our podcast, we are available to consult on your projects. Get in touch.